First of all, I want to say what a real pleasure it is to be with you. Um, I think the work that ELNED is doing at the moment is so important, as we'll find out in this discussion. A lot of the issues that we're dealing with are very complex. And for Israel, I think one of the most important things is to have open, honest channels of dialogue where we can share and we can grapple with those complexities with our friends, because that's the most helpful kind of interaction that we can have. And ELNED is really in the forefront of nurturing and facilitating those kinds of dialogue. It's a pleasure to be here with David Siegel, who is truly the most extraordinary products of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, a consummate diplomat, as any of you who have had worked with him know, but also a really very, very thorough, thoughtful, strategic analyst. So it's a pleasure to be with him. And I also want to pay tribute to Pascaline, who I've had the pleasure of being in dialogues and who under extraordinary pressure keeps calm, collected, and enables that dialogue to take place. So it really is a pleasure to be here. So Ari and David were both kind enough to call me a lawyer, but the truth is I'm a recovering lawyer. I've actually ceased to be an international lawyer a little while ago, but I hope that gives me a little bit of a perspective that I can share with you. And I think the question that Ari asked is a really important one. If we think about Israel's attitude to law over the 70 years of its statehood, it's actually changed quite dramatically. At the time that Israel was founded, most of the people involved in its founding thought that international law was one of the most important tools that we had on our side. It's interesting, I was in the year 2000 in Rome at the ceremony for the signing of the statute of an institution that's called the International Criminal Court. And the head of our delegation there was a wonderful, wonderful man, a judge called Eli Natan, a great humanitarian, a Holocaust survivor. And he had for most of his life been an active supporter of the court. And in fact, if you go back to the founding of that particular court, Jews and Israelis had been in the forefront of it. And yet at that conference, he stood up and made a speech explaining that Israel would no longer be able to become a party to the statutes of the court. So I think there's an interesting question. What's changed in international law? Why has something that we used to regard as being so supportive, why has that area become so challenging? And I think there's a number of things that have actually changed. I think the first is that for many years, the international institutions, the arena of international institutions, were relatively insulated from the politicization on the international sphere. The UN has always been a very, very political body. But in the 70s and the 80s, most of that political leverage, and we know it's a very problematic organization, because on any issue relating to Israel, there's an automatic majority, a combination of Arab states, Muslim states, the states of the non-aligned movement, which will all vote one way, and all of the Jewish states. Sadly, only one of them will vote the other way. So we know it's a very problematic institution. But during the 70s and the 80s, that automatic majority, that leverage was by and large restricted to the political organs of the international community. During the 80s and the 90s, that circle of politicization expanded to the human rights organs of the international community. Those of you who follow the Human Rights Council in Geneva and other human rights organizations will see a horrendous politicization of those organizations. The Human Rights Council, which has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than every other country in the world put together. It's extraordinary. And if you think about it, the real victims of that politicization are not Israel. The real victims are genuine victims of human rights abuses elsewhere in the world that never get attention because the spotlights are turned away from them. But I think what we saw happening in the late 90s and the 2000s, we saw an attempt to expand that circle of influence still further to from the human rights to the legal and judicial institutions of the international community. Not just the International Criminal Court. We saw the referral of Israel's security barrier to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, another international institution. We saw the rise of what's called universal jurisdiction, which is an attempt to try and capture individuals when they travel abroad in different jurisdictions and have them arrested to put into trial. So we see the expansion of those circles of influence. And I think we see a couple of other things as well. One of them that I think is important and we need to keep an eye on is that the actors on the international plane have changed as well. And there's an interesting way of seeing this. There's a sort of mental test that's sometimes called the skyline test. If you imagine yourself in any capital city in Europe, say, and you ask yourself, say you were there 200 years ago in the year 1820, and you ask, what are the tallest buildings on the horizon? The tallest buildings on the horizon in the 1820s would probably have been the steeples of the churches, because in those days, the power was concentrated in the hands of the religious institutions. If you fast forward 100 years to 1920 and you ask, what were the tallest buildings on the horizon? Then that would have been the Reichstag, the Big Ben. It would have been the parliamentary buildings because the power was concentrated actually in the hands of the state institutions. But today, if you ask yourself, what are the tallest buildings? Those are all dwarfed by the buildings of multinational corporations and international organizations and non-state organizations. And what we see is that while the structures that are still guiding international or state structures, we have other players, I would say in particular, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which are extremely active, very single-minded. Some of them are actually funded by states in order to advance their agenda. But that also creates an environment in which international law can be harnessed as a tool. There are other things we could point to, the media, which means that incidents which in the past would have been far away from the mind's eye are brought to screens in real time. And of course, the change in the nature of armed conflict, where we have not traditional armed conflict with armies against armies, but asymmetric conflicts, where you actually have one side which is in violation of the laws of armed conflict, deliberately embedding itself in civilian areas in order to try and create a public relations campaign and an international law campaign. So in all of those cases, we find that the arena, that the field of international law has become far more challenging for Israel, for other countries that are fighting threats from non-militant organizations and terrorist organizations. But there are things that we can do about it. Some of them I'm pleased to say Israel has been doing, and I'm sure we'll talk about those later in the discussion.
Thank you. It's really very interesting. I didn't think about what you say about the buildings that is giving us a very interesting information, church, parliament, and non-state organization. I will think about that. And you said, you spoke about Human Rights Council. I just want to tell to our friends, perhaps they don't know, that in all the meetings of the Human Rights Council, there is in the agenda what we call the Chapter 7, means that
Absolutely.
in every meeting of the Human Rights Council, the Chapter 7, the 7th point of the agenda, it's about Israel and the Palestinian conflict, always to criticize and to condemn Israel. But when you look at the agenda of the last meeting, the 44th session, the 17th of July, means a few days ago, it was not about the Chinese, the Turkish, not about anything that is going on wrong in the world, but it was Chapter 7 about Israel. Perhaps you will tell us a little bit more about that, but my second question would be, what today role has the international law? What role does it play in the Israeli-Palestinian relation, Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What is exactly the place of this international law?
So that's an interesting question, Aryeh. Thank you for asking. I had the opportunity of being involved in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for most of the rounds of negotiations in which we were involved during the 1990s. And what you could see then is you could actually see the role of international law, the role of law changing as the process went on. And it really charted, in a way, the spirit of the negotiations. So actually in the very, very early rounds of negotiations, I think international law, or law as a general tool, played an important role as a bridge between the two sides. You would walk into a negotiating room, and there would be Israelis and Palestinians who had literally fought on different sides of the barricades in the First Intifada. And the gulf between them was very great. And yet the lawyers on each side had a common language, they had a common skill set, and they were able, in a sense, to reach out. And of course, we also need to remember that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with are classic issues of international law. If you look down the index page of an encyclopedia of international law, you'll have what is statehood, what is an autonomy, what is sovereignty, and so on and so forth. And those are the core questions that very few lawyers get to deal with, but they were the bread and butter of the negotiations. So I think in those early rounds, there was a positive role that was played by international law. Then as the process went on, unfortunately, what we met with were agreements that weren't fulfilled. And then I think the lawyers on each side became defense attorneys. And if you like, the law became less of a bridge and more of a shield. It would say, we haven't done this because the other side didn't do that, or we have this legal justification, and so on and so forth. And then as we move forward from that, the negotiations broke down. And then international law primarily became, from the Israeli perspective, a guide to what you can and can't do in extremely complicated forms of security threat. And Israel is constantly facing extremely complex dilemmas on the security front. And it's not a coincidence. That is because that is the modus vivendi of militant and terrorist groups, to try to create extraordinary dilemmas for democracy. And we've had that with questions about, as I mentioned earlier, what do you do when missiles are being fired from the heart of civilian areas? What do you do in relation to flotillas that are trying to break a blockade on Gaza? What do you do with large numbers of people that are massing on fences, and so on and so forth? And in relation to all of those things, international law is probably one of the most important tools that we have in trying to gauge what is the right response. How do we apply the principles of international law are relatively clear. We have to make distinction between civilian targets and non-civilian targets. And once we have identified something that is a non-civilian, a competent target, if there are civilians in the neighborhood, we have to implement the principles of proportionality and also the principles of humanity. But in an environment that's constantly changing, constantly throwing out new challenges, international law is one of the tools at our disposal. Then I think if we went through international law as a bridge, as a shield, as a guide, then I think sadly the next role that it played in our negotiation, and I hinted at it before, that it's actually been used as a sword. It's really been weaponized by the Palestinians as part of an orchestrated campaign. And in a sense, the strategy is a pincer movement, whereas on the one hand, you will have these very complicated military security dilemmas that require Israel to respond. On the other hand, you have Israel, you have a public relations and an international law campaign. Let us try to have warrants issued against Israelis and so on. And sadly, it's genuinely a Palestinian strategy. Abu Mazen, the Palestinian president, actually wrote an article in the New York Times, said, we need to internationalize the conflict as part of our campaign against Israel. It's clearly part of a broader strategy. And I think today, while many of those things are still with us, today we are very much in an environment where there is an attempt to weaponize international law, both in the International Criminal Court, in other international legal institutions. And I think it's very important, I'm sure we'll talk about it, it's very important that we fight back against that, not just because it's critical for Israel, but because it's absolutely critical for every other democracy that is using similar tools in the fight against terrorism, that the legitimacy of these tools be upheld. And then finally, I would say, we live in hope that law ultimately will serve its higher purpose. It will be, if you like, the scaffolding of peace. I'll share with you something that troubles me. I've obviously read a lot of books trying to analyze the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations over the years. One's written by Israelis and books written by Palestinians. And one of the things that troubles me is that the books that are written by lawyers tend to be more extreme and less accommodating and less sympathetic to the other side than the books that are not written by lawyers. And it's sad to me because it says that lawyers, if there's something in law, if it's handled wrongly, that allows people to adopt more extreme positions. And I think that we have a responsibility, even as lawyers, to remember that we're also human beings, that we're also waging a war, if you like, for the future of our region, for the future of our children. And that the ultimate aspiration is for international law to serve as a scaffolding for a future peace agreement.
It's clear that we understand and we know the strategy of the Palestinian to internationalize the conflict. What is more surprising is that the international community seems that the community is supporting this strategy. And what's appear as clear for us is that the enemy of Israel want to turn a political conflict into a legal conflict. This is why we are talking about the lawfare. And the fact is that it will make this conflict insoluble. The fact is that they don't want peace, they don't want negotiation, they don't want to make concessions. They want Israel's surrender. That's what I feel. And ultimately, its demise. And they are not hiding it, by the way. So can you please elaborate a little bit more about the dilemma that arises for Israel in this international legal arena? How the Israelis are going to deal with that if the Palestinians have this strategy and they are supported by most of the international community, let's say, let's put on the side the American and some other countries, but most of the communities are on the side of the Palestinian in this strategy. So how Israel can manage itself in this international legal arena? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Oh, of course, thank you. First of all, I think it's fair to say that a fair number of countries, states in the world are a little schizophrenic. What they say publicly is not necessarily what they say privately. There are countries that agree with us on the private, but publicly they just don't feel that they can come out and say that. I remember being in a strategic dialogue with one country, explaining to them why there were measures in the fight against terrorism that we would not take because our Supreme Court has ruled that they're not acceptable. And they were absolutely astonished. They would say, why would you tie your hands in this way? Why wouldn't you use these measures? And literally on the same day, that country had a representative in the United Nations who was standing up, complaining that Israel was using disproportionate force and so on and so forth. So I think there's a sort of schizophrenia. And sometimes the things that countries think on the private are not necessarily what they think in public. I think there are a number of dilemmas. Probably the clearest dilemma that Israel faces as a result of this, politicization of international institutions is the question of whether we should cooperate with international legal proceedings and international investigations or not. And it's a tough call. Because on the one hand, we feel that we have a case to make. We want to make our case. We feel that we believe in openness, sunlight as a disinfectant, and we want to share what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And on the other hand, there is a fear that if we actually engage with these proceedings, we will be giving legitimacy to something that really doesn't deserve legitimacy in the first place. So how do we navigate that kind of dilemma? I would say it's a general rule. Israel's default position is to cooperate. And I think, during regular non-corona times, there are more investigations and international observers looking at Israel than there are certainly per capita than any other place in the world. On the other hand, there are certain occasions where an international initiative is so clearly biased, is so clearly not intended to find out the truth, that we have no choice but not cooperate. And I think probably one of the examples of that is the Goldstone inquiry. The Goldstone inquiry had a mandate that was clearly one-sided. It had a time frame that was clearly unworkable. Every request that we submitted to try and have it dealt with in a more reasonable way that would give a chance for the truth to come out was rejected. And so there are occasions where we decide that no, if we were to cooperate in this particular case, that would give legitimacy to a proceeding that doesn't deserve it. So that's an example of the sorts of dilemmas that that politicization of international institutions actually creates for Israel. What can we do? So I think the first thing is that we have to remember that what we are fighting here is not international law. What we're fighting is the misrepresentation of international law. International law, I have to say, still by far and large is a force for good in all sorts of areas. If you think about areas like land rights, if you think about trafficking in human beings, if you think about organized crime, the new arrangements, money laundering that have been put into place by frameworks of international law have definitely been positive steps. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's very, very important that people who are defensive of Israel shouldn't say that we are fighting against international law. International law has a very important role to play. What we are fighting against is the misrepresentation of international law. And here is something where we need to be active and our friends need to be active. You know, frequently we will come across statements that sound like they're statements of international law, but they're really perversions of international law. I remember, you know, the European Union came out with a statement during one of Israel's rounds of fighting in Gaza, where they say Israel has to refrain from attacks that endanger the lives or may endanger the lives of civilians because these are contrary to international law. Now, anybody that knows anything about humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, knows that if you are being attacked from the heart of civilian areas, you have to be extraordinarily careful. As I mentioned before, you have to act in accordance with principles of distinction and proportionality. But there is no principle of international law that says that you cannot defend yourself, that you cannot fight back. And if you were to have a principle like that, like the European Union said, just think what the implications would be. It would be an invitation to every terrorist organization in the world to set up shop inside a school or a kindergarten or a hospital. So I think we have to be very careful about those misstatements. I remember one time where one of the former Secretary Generals of the United Nations called Israel's occupation of the West Bank illegal. Now, the fact is you can call it a lot of things, but the fact of occupation is not illegal. And when that was brought to his attention, he had his spokesman issue a clarification, a hysterical clarification, where he said, when the Secretary General said the occupation was illegal, he meant illegal in the political and not in the legal sense of the word. Now, I have no idea what he meant by that, but I think we really have to be very, very rigorous about standing up for international law. The other thing is we have to challenge those people who are engaging with us to ask themselves the hard questions. You know, it's very easy to walk around the world with this pristine notion of international law and tell everybody that they're doing things wrong. But unless they're prepared to grapple with the difficulties, it's very hard to have a serious dialogue. I remember hosting an international group of jurists in Jerusalem, again, during one of our conflicts in Gaza. And after an hour or so of listening to their criticism, I said to them, so I hear what you have to say, but I'm interested. You've traveled to conflict situations all around the world. You've now seen the threats that we're facing here. Can you please tell me what, in your view, would be a lawful and proportionate response? And there were probably 3 or 4 minutes of silence. And then finally, the head of the delegation said, we can't answer that. It's an acontextual question. So I said, what sort of context would you like me to give you to enable you to answer it? But no amount of prodding would persuade him or his colleagues to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the muddy business of thinking, what does it mean to implement these fine, high-minded principles in practice. And if you're not prepared to do that, I think you lose your standing to engage in the debate. So that's one of the reasons I have to say that I think the kinds of dialogue that ELNET tries to foster between policymakers in Israel and in like-minded countries are so important. Because we really need to be on the same page. We really need to recognize that these principles of international law that people are trying to dilute are not there to just protect Israel. They're there to protect very, very fundamental principles that are important for protecting human rights in any democracy. And that's something that we need to work on together.